All right, well, welcome to Spiritual Reality, the Spiritual Reality Podcast. I'm so excited to be starting this brand spanking new podcast. I spent 3 years doing a different podcast, and I'm really excited about this one. It goes in a whole different direction, and so it's got a new name. And this podcast is going to be coming out every single Friday, and we're going to be breaking down what we see in the world from a biblical perspective. So I'm going to be breaking down world events again from a biblical perspective. I'm going to be throwing in some various things along the way to help you understand the Bible more correctly, because if we don't approach the Bible correctly, we don't understand the Bible correctly, then that's where we get into seeing some things in a wrong way. And the reason it's called spiritual reality is because it's like virtual reality goggles. When you put those goggles on, right, like you enter into a whole different world. And that's the way we want it to be for the Bible, that when you put on those biblical lenses, that you experience the world in a whole different way. And the reason that it's the reason for the word reality is because it's God that defines reality, right? We live in a world that God created. So if He created it, then He gets to define what is reality and what is not reality. And what He says about us and what He says about the world is true. And so I just want to say a couple things that this show's not going to be. First of all, this show's not going to be infotainment. And I debated about whether or not I should say that. Part of the reason that I'm saying it is because I'm not saying I don't want to somewhat be entertaining. I think some episodes will get into more and more of that, to where it just, there's just funny moments or whatever. But let me tell you why this is important. I love lots of podcasts that are infotainment. But, they bring you up to speed on what's going on in the world. They make fun of a lot of things, right? They often try to be the rightest about things. And so if they're trying to, their niche is to be in the conservative world, then they want to make sure they point out anybody who slips up and says something they're not supposed to say or whatever. And so they're quick to call out people for any little thing that may seem off. And they do it for clicks. Right? And obviously that works for them. And I'm not really looking to make fun of things. I'm not really looking to just carve out that I'm the rightest person on the internet. That's not really my goal. My goal is to take an honest biblical look at these issues and not just to say something outlandish that's going to get more clicks. And so in today's world, you might think, then why even do a podcast at all, right? Because you're not going to have as many followers if you don't play that game. And I'm just not down to play that game. That's just not something that I think is going to work for me. But because I think we've been trained to believe that the best digital content a lot of times is the content that gets the most clicks. And my hope is that Christians will be drawn to hearing solid biblical answers on real world issues. That's my hope. And so that doesn't mean that we're not going to have some fun along the way, but that's kind of what I'm thinking. And so now, another thing is I want to make clear, this show really isn't political. Now, at times you may think, even today, you may think, Jim, you're getting political. But the problem is that everything has become political today. And then Christians are told that they need to shut up about it because they shouldn't be political. So I'm going to dive into things that are happening in the world from a biblical perspective, which means at times certain parties are not going to look great. I'm just going to be honest. I'm not trying to promote a particular political agenda, but certain parties are sometimes they're just not going to look great. And so today I want to hit 3 big stories from the news this week and try to apply a biblical filter for how Christians should see them. And so today on the show, I want to talk, first of all, about the Bill Maher comment on abortion. I want to talk also about the new changes to Title IX. And I also want to talk about what's going on college campuses with the protests against Israel. So let's start with this Bill Maher comment and what he said about abortion. Because what he said was he said, abortion is murder, but we just don't care. And we're going to look at the actual quote here in just a second. I don't want to be irresponsible. And so this is a new low for pro-abortion arguments. The pro-abortion argument in the 80s and 90s was safe, legal, and rare, as some of you may know. And there was this sense that they were at least admitting this is not a moral good. Like, it's not a good thing morally. But their argument was, if it's going to happen, and it's probably going to happen anyway, let's make sure it's safe, right? And so through the years, the argument has changed to it's the woman's right to do whatever she wants with her body. That led to broadening abortion rights to the point that in some states, even partial birth abortion was legal. And so all along the way, no one wanted to call it murder, right? All along the way, they wanted to give some kind of euphemistic term for it, but they didn't want to call it murder. But now Maher is saying the quiet part out loud. They're just saying, we know it's murder, we just don't care. So listen to his quote. I'm going to read it to you, and just see what you think. He says, "That's why I don't understand the 15-week thing or Trump's plan to leave it to the states." You mean, so killing babies is okay in some states? I can respect the absolutionist position. I really can. And that's kind of cool. He's like, I can respect somebody who's just saying, look, this should stop altogether. He said, I scold the left when they say, oh, you know what? They just hate women. People who aren't pro-choice. So talking about people who aren't pro-choice, that they just hate women. He said, they don't hate women. They just made that up. They think it's murder. And it kind of is. And so he says, and it's just that, he said, I'm just okay with that. I am. I mean, there's 8 billion people in the world. I'm sorry, we won't miss you. That's my position on that. Is that not your position if you're pro-choice? And he says, you said you're pro-choice. That's your position too. So in a sense, he's just calling out both sides. He's calling out the so-called conservative politicians, saying, you're saying you're okay with certain amount of weeks or whatever, and that's hypocritical because it's, you think it's murder and it is murder. And he says, but let's just be honest. The pro-choice side is, we know it's murder, but we want the choice. We don't care. So there's a lot to say about this. First of all, it is murder. He's exactly right. And frankly, that's just science. That is just science. Science caught up with the Bible on this one for a while. Now we've known that once that egg is fertilized, a new person comes into existence. They may not be fully formed yet, but they have distinct DNA, and a new life is created. And David talks about the way that God knew him and formed him in his mother's womb. Jeremiah 1:5 says, before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. Before you were born, I set you apart. I appointed you as a prophet to the nations. And so God is telling Jeremiah, look, I knew you in the womb. So sometimes we'll break down the everything that the Bible says about babies in the womb and that kind of thing here on the show. That's not really my goal today. Just kind of wanted to dip my toe in the water and just talk about how do we react to this kind of thing. And so I think another thing to point out about his quote is that he's pointing out the inconsistency of Trump and the Republican Party. He's saying if it's murder, then it's murder, right? A 15-week ban doesn't make much sense. We'll leave murder up to some states doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And that's true. He's exactly right about the inconsistency of a conservative politician saying, I want to limit it a lot, but I don't want to stop it altogether. And so, politically, what should a Christian do with the scenario with which the scenario with which we're presented, right? I see a lot of Christians saying Trump has gone soft on abortion, so they can never vote for him again. I think there are political reasons for why he's positioning himself the way he is for the general election. But this show is not for political analysis. So I'm not trying to go into, why would Trump be saying this and that kind of thing. My goal is to have us look through this at this through a biblical lens. So can a Christian vote for a candidate that is not saying that all abortions should be banned? That's kind of become the litmus test for us as Christians. So here's the thing about this, I think, from a Christian's perspective. We live in a world, we live in a world where morality is black and white and should be black and white, but our choices are not. We absolutely should vote for the most righteous things that we can vote for. Proverbs 14 says, righteousness exalts a nation, but sin condemns any people. There is a sense in which the morality of our nation and doing the right thing is good for everybody. But we also should consider which choice is the best choice for our country. And so I'm not sure in this election that there is even a candidate on the ballot that would be 100% right on the issue of abortion or saying the 100% right thing about abortion. If you look at all the third-party candidates, I don't know that there's any. And so the question would be, who can continue to get us closer to where we should be, and who would drive us further into wickedness? That is our not great choice. And I know Christians get upset about this and they say, man, but like, let's just vote our consciences. We're not going to put up with the lesser of two evils and that kind of thing. But throwing your vote away by writing someone in or voting for a candidate that has absolutely no shot, more than likely is the way to make sure we get the worst option. Especially if you're a conservative. If you're a conservative and you're throwing your vote away on a write-in, or you're throwing your vote away to somebody who has no shot at getting elected, then more than likely you're making sure that the leading liberal candidate ends up winning the election, which means we're going to go way backwards on the issue of abortion. And so in America, we have just gotten used to kind of having a semi-Christian choice in all of our elections. Most countries don't have that option most of the time. In the Bible, God used Pharaoh to promote Joseph and to grow the entire nation of Israel into a mighty nation. God uses Cyrus to start rebuilding Jerusalem and rebuilding Israel. Progress can be made with imperfect leaders. However, in the U.S. system, I think primaries are a great place to push hard for candidates, to vote your conscience, for when it comes to what you really want to see in those primaries. I feel like we didn't really get that chance this time. The candidates were already set up already. So even by the time our state was having its primary, it was pretty much these two candidates are already representing their parties. And so, but the important thing to understand is we have to deal with reality, what actual reality is. And we may not get everything we want from one party, but we are likely to get everything we don't want from another party. And so we should be critical of both sides if they're not protecting life. Absolutely. We're not a homer for either party, right? But in the end, we should choose the candidate who can win and comes as close as we can get to what's right and can win, right? So, and of course I said that, but so now I know that doesn't sit well with Christians. We're very principled people. We absolutely, we want to push for the right thing, and we're willing to lose, even if it means, stand up for what's right, even if we lose. But we used to be such a majority in our culture that we used, to understand, we're used to kind of believing that if we could just all put our foot down and, we would just all, say, no, we're not voting for either one of these guys. We're all gonna vote for Franklin Graham. We're all gonna write in Franklin Graham. That it could just be done, right? But again, this just isn't reality. First of all, Christians who truly live out their faith are not in the majority any longer. So even if you got every single Christian in America to decide on the same write-in name, we would still lose the election. And not only that, you're not going to get Christians to agree, right? You're going to have some people want to vote for Franklin Graham, and some people writing in Tim Tebow, and some people writing in Chris Pratt, and some people writing in Francis Chan. So, it's just not going to happen. So if you vote for someone who is not one of the major candidates for your conscience sake, you are doing so knowing it is a losing strategy. And if you're a conservative Christian, again, you know that you're taking your vote from the candidate most likely to defeat the least godly option. Therefore, you're helping elect the least godly option. And so for me, that wouldn't help my conscience feel any better as I watch the country take another 4-year nosedive. And so that's just not something that I would be down for. And so folks like Maher like to call us hypocrites because we say this issue is really important, but then he points out, this idea that 15 weeks is still murder, and he's exactly right about that. However, I don't think that we can let that keep us from making the smartest decision, the wisest decision in this moment when we face the true reality that is in front of us. And so we're going to have more coming up as we jump into these other couple of stories right after this.
Want to equip your church, youth group, or Christian school with the answers they need to stand in a time of cultural decay? Contact Jim to book a Christ in Culture conference right away.
All right, well, I want to jump into this Title IX change, this new Title IX rule. The Biden administration has changed the application of Title IX to include protection for gender identity, which will likely supersede and undo all the state bans against biological men competing in women's sports. At least until this gets challenged by the courts. I would think this is going to end up in court pretty quickly. We are moving quickly towards gender identity becoming a protected civil right. And this is going to have ramifications for churches down the road. It's going to expand hate crime charges. And that's where all this is going. And as a culture, we have for years insisted that we have this separation of church and state, which is not even in the Constitution, by the way. But because of all the emphasis on this idea of separation of church and state, and frankly, the misinterpretation of the letter that Thomas Jefferson wrote about it, we have unhitched from Judeo-Christian morality as a society. Like we have a new set of values now by which we decide what is good and what is right. And so now we really have no set of values, solid values to determine what is right and what is wrong, except this. You may not have realized it, but we have replaced Judeo-Christian morality with Marxism and intersectionality. So I'm going to dive into this. I'm going to explain it. I hope that you follow along. The highest form of morality in our culture today is to cater to the most oppressed group on the intersectional scale. Now, if you're not familiar with this concept, it's the idea that there's a group of people who have all the power. They got to set all the rules. And then everyone who is not like that group is oppressed. So they're the oppressors and everybody else is oppressed by them. And so the more factors that you have that deviate from the oppressor class, then the more oppressed you are. So if, white Christian men are the people who have all the power in our culture, according to this way of thinking, they got to set the rules. So being a woman makes you a little bit oppressed, right? And if you're a woman of color, then you're a little bit more oppressed. And if you're a woman of color and a lesbian, then you're even more oppressed. And so trans individuals are pretty much kind of the top dog on the intersectional scale as far as the most oppressed people. And so therefore we need to restructure the right thing to do, the moral thing to do in this new type of morality that's not based on Christianity, is that we all need to make sure that we cater to the most oppressed group. And so, again, that means that in this view, the most righteous thing we can do is to make sure that whatever it is they're saying helps them, makes them feel more accepted, that kind of thing. That's what we need to do in order to elevate them. And so this is why, people that you would expect to defend women's sports are not doing it. They have bought into this thinking, and they feel like that women are oppressed. But if they're going to use that same reasoning for women, then they have to honor it when it's applied to trans rights. So for a long time, the feminist movement has now been not tied to equal rights, but tied to the concept of oppression. And once they made that shift into that intersectional scale of how oppressed they are, and constantly talking about that, they stepped into this Marxist ideology, critical theory ideology, which now means that they have to honor this same situation for people who are further down the intersectional scale than they are. So, talking about gender identity, first of all, there's no such thing as gender identity. Again, God defines reality. There are only two sexes in Scripture. And God says right at creation in Genesis 1:27, God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. Now, the concept of gender as it is used today is a completely made-up concept. It's an attempt to redefine reality. God gets to define reality, right? We talked about that. But this is just another attempt to rebel against the way that God wants us to function. And so there are two kind of typical arguments that people try to make from Scripture for this concept of the spectrum of genders, okay? And so some say that the fact that there are intersex people is proof that God is good with people being neither male or female. Or maybe a little bit of both, right? And so the fact that this happens, but however, this is a huge biblical misunderstanding that is common, where people assume that things that they feel or things that are messed up, like a genetic problem, that produces a person with characteristics of both sexes are God's design, right? And so if I feel this way, or there's this genetic issue, then hey, God made things like this, so therefore He's good with it. He's all in on this concept. And so it's kind of the "I was born this way" argument. And that worldview is missing the idea that we live in a fallen world. That's a huge biblical principle that our world is not reasoning from at all. We live in a fallen world. Things are broken. We are born with a sin nature, so we cannot trust our feelings. And we can't redefine what God says by assuming that something that is broken is God's design. So cancer is not God's original design. That's genetic problems that we are broken because of sin, right? Sin introduced death and physical mutations into the human race. Genetic mistakes are not God's design. Does He know who's going to have those issues? Yeah, he does. Does He allow those things to happen? And instead of interfering with every single consequence of the fall, yeah, He does. Sometimes He does interfere with some consequences of the fall, but a lot of times He is not stepping in and stopping every consequence of the fall. Part of that might be that if we see the consequences, we'll turn back to Him, right? Which is our greatest need. But can He turn all of that into something amazing, even if those consequences still happen? Absolutely. So the fact that there are individuals where something went genetically wrong as they were being formed in the womb does not mean that God is for all people moving back and forth from gender to gender. So that's kind of the I was made this way kind of argument. Then also, people will often point to eunuchs in the Bible as proof that God is fine with people choosing to be less male. And they want to compare this to gender surgeries that are performed today. And here's the problem with that. The Bible doesn't talk about people doing this to themselves, and certainly doesn't endorse them having it done to themselves. And so in Matthew chapter 19, Jesus talks about eunuchs, and He says there's three types. And so keep in mind, He was just asked a question about marriage and divorce. And He made it clear that divorce generally should never happen aside from one exception. So then the disciples ask, if it was better that people just not marry. Like, man, if that's the standard, like a lot of people are not going to be able to live up to that. And so is it just better if people just don't get married? And so that prompts Jesus to say this in verse 12, Matthew chapter 19, verse 12. Here's what He says. For there are eunuchs who were born that way. So there are people who are unable to reproduce, and they were born that way. That there's something that went wrong. And He says, and there are eunuchs who have been made eunuchs by others. We'll get into that. And He said, and there are those who chose to live like eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom. Notice the words chose to live like, not become, live like. And He says the one who can accept this should accept it. So most of the time, a eunuch was in a position where the person over them did not want them to have the ability to reproduce. So the ruler or master would have that person castrated. The person in charge of the king's harem in the book of Esther was a eunuch. Makes sense. He didn't want this guy messing with any of his women. Okay. Again, God never says this is a great idea. There's no moment where God ever says, yeah, that's fantastic. But Jesus says that some people are also born unable to reproduce. And then He says some people are made that way by others. And He says some people choose to live that way without marrying, without reproducing for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. Again, the key words there are live like. Jesus doesn't say He thinks it's a great idea that, that people are castrating other people. He doesn't say that it's a great idea for people to castrate themselves. He's not endorsing that. He's again answering a question is, should some people maybe refrain from getting married? And He said, you know what? Some people might live like eunuchs. In other words, they don't get married, they don't reproduce in order that they can live all out for the kingdom of God. And so He's not talking about living like a eunuch and making yourself more feminine. And so the context, I think, shows that. So in Scripture, other than castrating yourself, which is never talked about in the Bible, and certainly would not be endorsed, the only way that you can kind of attempt to present yourself as the opposite sex would be to dress like the opposite sex. And this is what God tells his people, the people of Israel, in Deuteronomy 22. Listen to what he says in Deuteronomy 22, verse 5. He says, "A woman must not wear men's clothing, nor a man wear women's clothing, for the Lord your God detests anyone who does this." And so, if God doesn't want a person even pretending to be the opposite sex by attempting to dress like them, it would only make sense that he would definitely not want us to cut up our bodies to try to become the opposite sex as well. Again, there weren't gender surgeries in the Bible, so these are the principles that we have to go on. So as Christians, it's important that when we see things like these changes to Title IX, that we don't enter into this redefinition of God's reality. We're not playing that game, right? There's no doubt that by including gender identity into Title IX, we risk losing women's sports altogether, right? And this is definitely an issue that Christians should be speaking out on. We need to be able to talk intelligently about these issues and be grounded in solid biblical beliefs when it comes to this kind of stuff. And so we can't allow concern over hurting someone's feelings to stop us from protecting young girls all over the country, right? That's a priority. Now, that doesn't mean that we have to be hateful about it. Doesn't mean that we should be sarcastic and cutting, but we do need to be firm on this. And so, again, really, really important situation right now going on in our culture, and I think the biblical lens is the best one. We've got more coming up right after this.
Get biblical answers to culture's most controversial issues. Order Christ in Culture on Amazon today.
Well, I want to close out the show today, and I want to kind of dive into these campus protests that are going on in support of Palestine. And you may have seen at many Ivy League schools and prestigious schools, students are protesting, setting up encampments, which appear to be funded by outside sources because all the tents perfectly match. I'm not going to get into conspiracy theories on that. That's somebody else's show. But some of the chants are disturbing. Death to America, from the river to the sea, which just simply means that they want the nation of Israel wiped off the face of the earth because they want the land all the way from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea. They want that to become Palestinian territory or a Palestinian state and not Israel. Some try to distinguish between the nation, which they refer to as Zionism, and the Jewish people. And they want to say that they're against the Jewish nation or against this current Israeli government, but they're not against Jewish people. But that really doesn't make the movement much better. Israel is an established democratic nation. Its people have reclaimed the land that was theirs since the time of the judges. Palestine was never fully recognized as a nation, including, recognized by the surrounding Arab nations. Parts of that area have been controlled, in the last 100 years or so, by Egypt, Jordan, and also by England right before it became a nation. So it's not like Israel in 1948 took a nation from somebody else. And so, Does anyone else find it strange that all of a sudden college students have become so passionate about this issue, right? I mean, do you find that strange that all of a sudden college students, 5 years ago, you would have never heard any college students talking about, what's going on in Palestine, the Palestinians, like nothing. But all of a sudden, they're super passionate about establishing a nation for the Palestinians, and they seem to be so convinced that Israel is committing genocide against them. And so you may have seen some of the interviews with some of the college students. They literally don't have any idea what they're talking about. One student was at NYU. I think she had come from another university, maybe Columbia. They asked her, hey, why are you out here protesting? And she began to ramble about how, they're there to support the Palestinian people and to force NYU to stop supporting things that Israel supported. But she proceeded to say, I actually don't know what they're doing. Talking about NYU. I'm actually not real sure. And then she asked the people around her, hey, does anybody know what NYU is actually doing to support Israel and doing against the Palestinian people? And nobody could really answer the question. So how can somebody be so passionate about something and they don't actually know anything about the situation? So to answer that, we end up right back at the discussion on Marxism. I would say that's that's going to come up a lot because a lot of what you see going on culturally is kind of shot through with Marxism. So we're going to keep coming back to that. But the reason huge protests can spring up so quickly for causes like this goes right back to that concept of oppressed and oppressor and the intersectional hierarchy. The nation of Israel is considered an oppressor by the woke mob that decides this stuff, and the Palestinians are considered oppressed. Why? What did Israel do to be considered an oppressor? Not really anything, to be honest with you. Obviously, there have been some wars, almost all of which Israel didn't start. So there's some bad blood between both sides. Obviously, in war, a lot of people get mad about what the other side does. But the main reason Israel is labeled an oppressor is because they're successful, which means that they're powerful. And it's the same reason that the American system is considered an oppressor as well. So instead of these nations nearby actually just creating a culture where everyone can thrive and people can be employed and they can be productive and they can have a strong GDP and they can export things that the rest of the world wants and everybody really flourish, instead of doing that, they actually just want to tear down Israel because Israel is more successful. And so, thus the nation of Israel is considered colonizers, occupiers, and oppressors. So because our universities are just so saturated with this Marxist thought, all you have to do to get a huge crowd of protesters nowadays against something that is branded as an oppressor or colonizer is just indicate that their success is causing other people's suffering. So you just have to say, they're over here succeeding and these people over here are being held down. And it's always a zero-sum game with them. And so you do that without even checking facts, right? You don't even have to check the facts, and you can draw a crowd because these people are oppressors and these people are oppressed. And again, one of the main ways you decide who's oppressed is who has things going well for them and who has things not going well for them. Sorry. And so many claim that Israel's responsible for the subpar conditions in Gaza. Thus spinning it as genocide, right? Because clean water and food are sparse in Gaza, without even realizing that Israel has given over control of Gaza to the Palestinians, and they elected Hamas as their leaders. So how should a Christian think about the state of Israel, think about the Jewish people? I just want to say, first of all, I've got a whole blog on this at jimrichmond.net. I encourage you to go there. If you have never signed up on the website, there's 3 different opportunities that you have on the website to subscribe to 3 different mailing lists. There's parenting, there's biblical worldview, and then there's also church leadership as well. And so you may want to sign up for all 3 of those mailing lists, but I encourage you to do that. I encourage you to go to the blog and check out the blog on how Christians, or should Christians support Israel. Check that out. But God has repeatedly declared that nations that support Israel will be blessed. He said right from the beginning with the Abrahamic covenant that all nations are going to be blessed through Abraham because Jesus Christ is going to come through Abraham. But the nations that support Israel will be blessed. And so the Jews are God's chosen people. And we know that he cares really deeply about them, which means that we should as well if God cares about it. And God's final plans for the world include the Jewish people being back in their land as a nation. And so that doesn't mean that we can't critique the nation of Israel, and maybe mistakes or decisions that they make at times. No nation is perfect, but overall they should have our support. And that shouldn't be that difficult since they are not the aggressors in the Middle East. Right now, the media is attempting to paint them as the aggressors because they're trying to root out and destroy all of Hamas so that what happened on October 7th can never happen again. And the U.S. would take the exact same approach. Let's just be honest. If we were attacked that way, which some college students have a problem with, they think we're oppressors all around the globe. And so they're attempting to finish what Hamas started, and they're taking great pains and even increased casualties to avoid hurting civilians in the process. And so, we definitely should be and can be supporting Israel. I know that, lately they had the tragic mistake in bombing the aid vehicles recently. But again, for us as Christians, I think we support Israel, right? That's the biblical approach. And it doesn't mean that we can't be critical or that kind of thing. So again, I encourage you to head over to jimrichmond.net, check out the blog. And I just want to say, as we've covered these 3 topics today, if you've got anything at all that you want us to cover on the podcast, if you've got biblical questions, you've got things going on in culture that you would love to have an answer, a biblical perspective or a biblical answer on, I encourage you to send those in to me. You can either comment, you can direct message me, or you can go to jimrichmond.net and just use the contact form. Thank you so much for joining me for this, the first episode of Spiritual Reality.